Well, sounds like marvellous. Are there any questions? Not on Edmund, I'm going to join myself now to the round table now. Are there any questions around comments? Yes.
Thanks so much. This was a really wonderful presentation. I wonder if I could...
It'd be better if 7 minutes, so don't mind.
Yes.
I'll make those available to you.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
I had two questions which come under the bracket of ecology and environment. So one is the extent to which the AHRC is sort of factoring into its thinking on digital expansions, questions of climate change and current predicament that we're in. And then the other, whether there are specific projects in which digital projects in the AHRC are actually engaging with questions of ecology and environmental change.
It's an area of very great interest. First of all, I think increasingly, as an aspect of what I was saying about the materialities of computing, everybody is becoming conscious that the cloud is some evanescent thing out there. There's a large number of server farms in places like Arkansas pouring out large quantities of greenhouse gases, and the issues of green computing are very significant and very important in this. I think what's interesting is that awareness. And what's particularly interesting is the way in which one of the areas where I think digital humanities has made its most direct contribution in recent years has been precisely in working with what is our domain office to directly investigate these issues. So indeed the project Lord Hughes was involved in called Weather, which was using crowdsourcing of shiploads in order to reconstruct history of weather systems in the past. And there's really quite a dramatic expression of the value of digitizing data in that way. Also, Lorna's had some very interesting performance work. There's a project called the Snows of Yesteryear, which in Wales has been collecting oral history testimony about extreme weather events, with a view to thinking again about how one gears oneself up for extreme weather events of that kind. And had, again, an amazing performance in manga by a performance artist from Wales, who was recreating a drama around the severe winter in 1962-63, that connected Welsh nationalist protests against the flooding in the Trevor Valley. And it's very interesting how that all interconnected. So they're there. A major area for research councils in the future is global uncertainties. That's going to be a major theme in the future. And obviously climate is a major component of that. And I find actually the Met Office a particularly exciting group of people to work with at the moment. We did an event after V&A a couple of months ago with them. And there's some really interesting work going on at the Met Office, which is a very good way of cross-connecting between science and humanities in that way. Weather appears to be, I don't know whether it's because we're obsessed with it as a nation, but it appears to be a good avenue for that sort of dialogue between science and humanities, which is at the heart of digital humanities.
Thanks. Maybe I can just catch the breath for a minute. And I've asked Mathieu, who is a research fellow at the Knowledge Leader Institute and has worked on the LED project, to give a sort of response or any thoughts to contribute to this. And also Edmund, who is the research associate who works on the tremendously successful Reading Experience database, which is the sort of sister project of this, to say a few things. I've asked them to do this in preparations, and I've said that they're to speak no longer than 4 minutes 32 seconds. It's just the number I So, Mathieu.
Yeah, I started to. Just to be sure.
Yeah.
So thank you, Trevor, and thank you for the talk. I think it's really inspiring, especially for me, because, as you just mentioned, I work at the Knowledge Media Institute. I don't know if you know much about it, but it means I know nothing about what you do. I'm a guy who fiddles with computers, I do technologies. And generally, the arts and humanities are not my area. And it's a bit of a mystery to me, and kind of understanding a bit better the way it works. It is one of my interests, and I work with Alessandro on setting up the technical platform for them. And through that, we kind of get a better understanding. Now, one point I want to pick up is actually on the title, digital transformation. Because I'm really interested about what you say about what kind of transformation we can expect and what would be the level of transformation. Also, a bit about what we mean by digital humanities, because that's again a mystery to me. As a derivation, I'm even more puzzled by some people calling themselves digital humanists. If you are a digital humanist, know that I imagine you as people made of reasonably big pixels, like Mario in a video game, or Minecraft. Just some humanists made of pixels. But I don't think this is what you mean. You mentioned there is a basic idea, but the simple definition, humanities using computers. That's a simple one. But I think it's not very satisfactory, in the sense that, especially for me coming from an external point of view, and as a researcher in technology, what I would be looking to understand is how I transform the practice, and especially the research practice. As the research methodologies and the research approach, you are kind of putting into your work are being transformed by the presence of technology. And somehow there is a bit of, I'll say, a change in the way technology transforms research. My naive view of the way technology has been contributing to science, to any science, and possibly to arts and humanities too, in the past, is by having research methodologies and research questions, research directions, or research programs that require instrumentation, that require tools to make them happen. And what we see, and some of the transformations that you talked about, seem to be going the other way around. Is the technology evolving so much that we end up having tools we didn't ask for. We end up having tools that are not required by the research practices, but that the research practices kind of need to explore to understand better how to use them. So, kind of to answer some of Trevor's question, I think there might be three ways of doing digital humanities. One, which seems to happen a lot, and I'm not going to say that in a pejorative or a negative way at all, is a bunch of humanists kind of geeking around with new technology, just having gadgets and trying to figure out what possibly they could do with it, which is very useful as an exploratory way. The second one is a bunch of humanists trying to produce, to create the new tools and the new material, to create the base research material and the base instrumentation for the existing research practice to be made more efficient, or for them to scale, for them to get better. And the last one is humanists creating new research methods, starting exploiting the technology, starting exploiting the fact that we have these new materials, these new tools, to change the methodology, to change the way. And somehow, a bit like, is there going to be any humanities research comparable to experimental physics? Are you going to build models of the history of listening and validate this model through experiments using the data we have collected with them? But I think these are the kind of swift trends, and lead and red very clearly contribute to number two. I mean, there is a bit, and certainly in Alessandro's talk, you can see there is a bit of thinking around with tools. That's very clear, and we all like that. But clearly, lead and red are producing base material for the research practice and for possibly the future research practices. And one thing that I would like to see, not because it doesn't exist, but because I don't necessarily see it from an external point of view, is how this new material is actually going to be used. What are the new tools that are needed, and what are the research practices that are going to emerge from these things, and that we can experiment because lead and red are happening.
So that's very interesting. I know I found you a few more response now, but it is it is, I think, quite interesting. I mean, the story usually goes that I've got a very brilliant student, PhD student, who's been writing a project on traditional music, and he's sort of done this big piece, and he's done a discursive thing alongside it. And one of his main sort of contentions is that digital humanities is just a phase we're going through. You know, it's like puberty. It's very exciting and confusing at the time, but then you just get used to it. You know, and that eventually we just get back to humanities. On the other side, you can say that it does sort of very dramatically change things, and the lead, and certainly the RED project is a very good example that you can ask questions which you previously could not have asked, and you can, revisit questions which apparently have been answered perfectly well. But I think there's some flaws in that, but I mean that's the usual sort of thing.
Yeah, I tend to try and avoid the this question.
Yeah.
I used to do a lot of work when I was running a centre that would work on the history of Freemasonry a lot. I got far more, the dinner conversations were far more difficult, far more difficult about digital humanities than they ever were about Freemasonry. So I'm not sure that actually an a priori definition, and then one builds on that, is the best way of proceeding. To some extent, I talk about trying to hint at that. But I think that you described very clearly the sort of areas of concern, the major ones. It's that I suppose where I be anxious is the geeking around the technology area, because I don't think that's what's happening. I think to some extent that happens where you've got the newer areas, where I'm, for example, thinking about how we're fitting in 3D printing into the way in which we're doing things. That is an area of experimentation and exploration. But I think at the heart of the digital humanities, and escape from it derives from, and it goes back to the experiment that work I mentioned by Father Busa in the 1940s. It derives from a belief that the sorts of primary materials we use in the humanities present particular problems in terms of understanding their organisational structure and their role in knowledge. And that what we have to do is to think very deeply about the way in which that's done. In the very early days of humanities computing, the answer for a lot of that, where it was to a very large degree textual, was SGML. And from that, the text encoding initiative standardised set of tools for markup text. And you can't go very far in digital humanities without hearing those initials TEI emerged. TEI is in a sense the heart of it all. And also, thinking of the historians, how you fit things into relational databases. As a result of that, the humanities was actually an enormously powerful driver in the emergence of XML. And XML, in a sense, is a suite of technologies that makes the web as we currently understand it go. And somewhere out there, there's a humanities department with a wonderful impact case study, because it can show a very fundamental contribution to the modern development of the web. I don't know which one it is. Oxford's probably got the best name of anywhere in the UK, but someone's got that. The problem for me with digital humanities is that maybe we've lost impetus that we had in those early days, and there are fundamental questions where we're not getting the leverage. And to my mind, that question at the middle of digital humanities, but it's difficult to say at the middle, I think it's at the heart, is the question about semantic structures and the semantic web. And I think that is where we feed in. And I thought, again, the example of Mozart was a wonderful one. You look at what Google's doing to disaggregate Mozart's and Britain's on Google using Wikipedia. The net result is something that is accurate, but looks like a travesty of humanistic understanding. And as the example of Hack Music demonstrated. And at the moment, all around them that's being made by commercial companies. And that is a point where people with understanding of the way in which humanities disciplines work and the way in which we structure knowledge could actually feed power from within. And it puzzles me as to how we can get any leverage. So I think that's at the heart of digital humanities. But I'd always be the first to emphasise its range and to be very anxious not to exclude some of the more practice-based activities that I mentioned before. And I think practice-based has a lot to contribute here.
So, does anyone want to preempt this or shall I? Edmund King is the research associate on the reading experience database, which is a much more mature project than the listening experience, which has been written along with 33,000 entries in it, and it's being used quite widely. And one of the things which it's done is to extend internationally, which is something which the listening experience wants to do, is to look beyond, for example, the English language. So there's translation tools with partners in different parts of the world. So we've invited Edmund to contribute to this, and I'm very grateful to him.
Okay, well, thank you, Trevor. I guess one of the interesting things about READ is that it really kind of bridges the world from before DH until DH. Now, it started off essentially as a box full of actual physical forms, filled out by people contributing reading experiences, and then it was put onto the web in 2007 as a result of the AHRC bid. So really it's a project which pre-existed and it's been taken into digital form. It is, as you say, a mature project, but that's not to say there aren't ongoing problems, and there are problems which go to the heart of what you'd like to be talking about digital humanities. And it's really about, it's as simple as the kind of link between digital and humanities. I think these projects really do need a very clear and ongoing commitment to programming and digital support. And we haven't actually had a program like this project now for a few years. And that means that while we can still do collections and keep on doing the other things we've been doing since 2007, the actual ongoing work of new forms of visualization, of output, of analysis, we can't really do this until we get external funding. And so we need to apply for more funding to get specific programming time attached to the project, which means that the research questions, when we get them, we can't really put them into practice for a couple of years afterwards, which really does get in the way, I think, of the kind of work we want to do. And I think a lot of universities are keen to have DH as part of their, of what they do, but without that kind of understanding, you need a very smart set of programmers, like Mathieu, behind the whole set of questions. Then you're not going to be able to get these projects to fulfill their potential. So I think that while we have collaborations going on, we have good kind of relationships between people in different countries. Actually putting that into practice and getting truly international read, for instance, into our operations be much more problematic, simply because of the IFC and programming challenges that are behind that. We can talk to people, but we can't necessarily get services to talk to each other without that set of infrastructures behind them.
That's very fundamental. I mean, that actually hits the nail on the head about the issues of developing digital humanities very precisely. I was previously at King's College London, which had built up what was really the largest set of programming facilities for humanities activity in the UK. But actually keeping that going financially was a nightmare because it was all dependent on soft project income. Terrible for programmers because they would get shifted from project to project with more money. They didn't fit into the career structures of humanities. Some of them had doctorates and were pursuing this as a way of pursuing an aspect of their academic interests, but they were in what were regarded as professional posts, so there wasn't any promotion mechanisms. And the old thing is that actually the structures that we've had in universities are actually going in almost the opposite direction to what we want to create those facilities, because the cleft between academic and professional services is getting greater. Our emphasis is on the academic as a teacher and on the researcher, rather than keeping these infrastructures in place. See, that is really the big problem, because these humanities almost invariably need a team, need programming support, and the difficulty is it's not like a book where you can finish it and point to it. It keeps going, and you've got to keep it going somehow. And these are the real what makes these humanities different in many ways, and very difficult to keep going. The other thing I will add is that you must have been funded within the first 2 years of the AHRC.
Yes, very much.
The AHRC just announced a call to celebrate its 10th anniversary. They're offering money to projects funded within the first 2 years for CG money. So I'm not sure whether it would certainly we want the RED to be flagged up as one of the successful projects in the first 2 years.
Yeah, sense of birthday. It's very interesting, the issue of sustainability. The other thing I was wondering if you could comment on is a personal sort of doubt I have. But I mean, I'm very committed to. I mean, I'm incredibly impressed by the reading experience database. I've looked at it. I mean, do you happen to know how much? I mean, do you keep track on the sort of discursive outputs by other people, the extent to which it's used? You can say this book would never exist without read or something like that. Or this project, or this author, or this piece of brilliance.
There's no specific kind of auditing for this which is done formally, but I mean, I do often get a look at scholar and do research to see what's out there, and there is a lot of citation going on. But there's also this kind of thing with citation of digital resources is kind of underdone quite a bit. There's quite a bit of invisible use of read. And there's one monograph in particular, I won't name it, but it was basically based on a series of researchers, and all of the read citations were taken out of the footnotes during editing. So now the book has no apparent relationship with read, even though it's based entirely on researchers.
I'm told that there is a reluctance in the academic community to cite electronic resources as opposed to paper resources. It's something that is on.
Well, it also makes pragmatic sense, doesn't
Yeah.
it? So the newspapers have a similar problem.
Yeah.
If you've got your citing newspapers, you've got a newspaper in front of you, it makes sense to build process.
Yeah, absolutely.
September 1993, rather than the URL.
Yeah.
I think that won't actually profoundly change until we start to see more of the hope of that is embedded links in electronic versions of books. Because that's why it's tragic with that book you described with the red database. Is really what you want to do is be able to click on the footnote and go straight to the red entry, and then you really be looking, I think.
Yeah.
One or two things will start to appear like that, but until we have more availability of these books in that form, I think it won't be a take-off.
The other point, I mean, if anybody wants to come into this conversation, do, because I hope people will ask questions or comments. The other point that was being put to you concerns the sort of the way in which this entire agenda affects, scholarly practice, as it were. And it's very interesting you've done this work on this peasant revolt. I can imagine you've been the local scholar there doing whatever you have to do and so on.
I still very much approach it.
Yeah. Well, I've just written part of a master's program at the Open University in which I describe this project partly in order to coerce the students to be actively involved in it, and partly, and maybe it's a historical thing. One of the things that I found difficult to do was to, figure out in my own mind what the key message I was trying to get, what the key skill was that I was trying to get over to the students. Because when one teaches them, you give them information and then try to develop skills. But one of the great doubts I have about it, and which I sort of did share in this piece, was the fact that the creation of large databases has one possible detrimental effect, which is that there is a lot of stuff which is then left over, which either because it is not fashionable or it is too much sort of hard work on, it is going to be left behind. There is a sort of a body of sort of orphan data. And the great endeavour of the up-and-coming scholars will be to work on things for which these huge databases already exist, which will give the starting point for the scholarly endeavour. I was about to say that I was struck when Helen and Simon were speaking earlier on that there was only one item coming into the database from an archive.
Yes.
Yes.
Whatever it was. I thought that was very
But
interesting.
it's partly about knowing about it, isn't it? It's sort of, I need to, when I'm doing something separate on that, I need to think, oh, I should drop the line to Helen if I find a reference to something missing.
Yeah, that's
I
right.
want to get to that frame of mind.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But generally, do you think that that sort of concern is at least one, or is it naive or this idea?
No, I think that's actually an emerging part of the humanities. In the early days, to some extent, we had to act as advocates for using technology. The doubts were so profound that you had to actually, no, you can actually get easy access to stuff and it's better than you can search it and look and do all these things with it. And you have to do that. I think now we've got to the point where we've actually got to encourage people to use these things in a critical way because they're not being used in a critical way. So, a good example, the Berkeley newspapers which represent stuff that Charles Berkeley gathered in the London coffee houses fairly randomly, pretty consistent runs, and frequently, I fear, taken as representing a substantial part of the corpus of 18th century.
That's right. Yes.
And we need to have a better awareness.
Yeah, we make too much of it.
Yeah. With these canonicities are emerging, which we're just taking for granted. Old Bailey is an interesting case at that point. It was something that was an incredibly obscure resource would be packed with references to this thing until recently, but has now become so well known that it's quite economical validity. And some sources which have been used in print have fallen out of favour because they're not available. So actually that part and parcel of what we have to discuss, I think. But that must be in the music world generally even more interesting and varied in its landscape than historical sources.
It has been used quite a lot actually, because of litigations between musicians. I know Jenny Nicks. Well, she was. I mean, Jenny Nicks, I did see her earlier on the part of the building now, but I'm sure she wouldn't mind we mentioned that I examined a PhD thesis, and she's done incredible work on which I don't think is. I mean, she's brought the data, but it's not a database, on insurance companies in the 18th and 19th century, which reveal stocks of musical instruments and publications and so on. And I found it absolutely fascinating. And in that sense, it does have a perspective which really is new, because somebody thinks of something you haven't thought of. I mean, that happens all the time, I know. But it isn't just a particular idea, it's an idea about a whole source domain, which I think is interesting. And Richard, do you?
Yeah, I just wanted to personally agree with everything that was being said, but I do think that there is a very good point that you made there, Trevor, about the dangers of reification of certain ways of thinking about information which get bypassed through databases. I think, Mathieu, you made a very interesting point there about whether or not this is going to change, create, if you like, not too dramatic, as a paradigm shift in the way that we actually think about knowledge. But there's an example in Helen's example where the categorization of music, which has been a genre, those genre categorizations are themselves highly ideologically constructed, yet if they're not critically understood, they become fixed and rarefied within the structure of the database itself, and they create almost unchangeable and unchanging categories, which need to be in themselves subject to criticism. So in other words, it's not just the content, it's the structure as well that has to be and we need critical tools to be able to question and possibly affect change in the structures themselves, which is often not the case. And I deal with a lot of databases which have been fixed. The structures of them are fixed. The content can be fantastically rich and useful, but it can have a strong detrimental effect on the quality of the information that we're extracting from.
I think that's a very fundamental point. It's interesting hearing about how one draws on other databases. Something like the British Library Catalogue is an amazingly complex archaeological artifact to understand how to put it together. And there's this tendency when something becomes data to stop thinking about it and take it away. I think that's actually part of what digital humanities is doing there, is that critical understanding of data structure.
Yeah.
Trevor?
Sorry. I said David.
I just wonder whether, in addition to the ideological problem, there's also sheer overwhelming quantity problem in the sense that they present vast amounts of material as compared to a visit to an archive. Whether that might lead to a bias towards certain statistical methods of dealing with such a large corpus of material. The close reading of an old-fashioned might be discouraged, or might be led, for example, towards using a smart piece of software to analyze the semantic content of a database.
Yeah, I mean, the fashionable analogy between the microscope and the macroscope.
Yeah.
So that you could kind of switch lenses. So that you could take something like your daily proceedings and see vast movements of population going on in them, but then switch to an individual and actually see the story of them moving. So that's the kind of way in which we think of it at the moment. I think there's apprehension about quantitative methods. There's a lot of it, inherently a lot of possibility in quantitative methods to tell the data. In fact, it's been there in economic and social history for a long time. I don't think we should be scared of it. I'm terrible education, but I don't think one should be scared of it. It is there, but I think one does want a mixture of methods and a mixture of research practices, because I think there's all my agreement on that.
You're absolutely right though, about the danger of moving away from the close reading of text, which is the traditional thing that we do, and that's what we do. But I've been sort of taking it that these large quantitative methods are the things that lead you to the text, that identify the text. This must have happened a lot in the writing project.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can do close readings of reading experiences or listening experiences in the same way that you can do close readings of text. It's very, very similar. It's the same kind of work. It's a matter of navigating to those kind of items, discrete items you want to analyze. But kind of getting back to the point that you made earlier, I think that we should also be careful about the contents of databases and the possibility for biases kind of creeping into them as a result of the way in which databases are created. I was struck by the point made in the first talk that most of what has gone into leaks so far has been from printed leaks and diaries, and the result of that, of course, has been a major kind of bias towards professionals, kind of higher groups, and I guess celebrities as well, because who else has got to have their letters and diaries published in book form? So that kind of bias is kind of baked into databases right from the very beginning, I think, if you don't take the broadest possible sweep of potential sources for input.
Related to that, of course, the major sort of element in the room for both read and read is that it is the issue of literacy for the 19th century. We've been looking at some ways of trying to sort of third-party reporting. So
This is a very good point, and I completely agree with Edmund. I wanted to make the same point. But, I mean, the same point is slightly different way. Data introduced bias, whatever it is. There is no objective way of collecting data, there is no objective way of interpreting data. And why we keep saying, and you can see that in Alexander's talk, that there are large databases around and you can just bring data into them, from them into your own and start analyzing. These databases are large as they can be, and it's even more the larger they are, they would bring biases. I mean, we have done a small piece of research work on the technology side where we could link data sets and compare them to try to have a comparative view of what biases they have with respect to each other. So the results are pretty kind of unsurprising, but at the same time very vivid. For example, we could show that Wikipedia, the universal encyclopedia of everything, has an extremely strong bias towards the US in the second half of the 20th century. It's a bias that is not completely obvious if you look at the data, if you bring some. You bring some data, but it's a bias that you can quantify, you can show that there is the information is richer and more up to date for items that relate to the US in the late 20th century. And you can't get away from it.
Of course, there's also a question of power in there, because there was a famous case of somebody who lived next to the pyramids at Giza, and wanted to correct the coordinates of their location, because he lived there, you could see them out his window, and he knew they were wrong. I think it was Wikipedia. And every time he corrected them, somebody in the US corrected them back to him.
Because
So that happens in every database. There are much more kind of authoritative databases, like GeoNames, who will disagree about with Wikipedia or with Milton Keynes Council about which district we can see in Wikipedia. Some will say Milton Keynes Borough, the other ones will say Buckingham Church. And these are completely based in facts on which they should be used. So, there is an element that it kind of draws towards some certain methods for analysis. It also draws towards the bias goes towards the topics too. In somehow, the availability of data pushes researchers into certain areas rather than others, and that is very damaging. I mean, this is something which is very well known, or something very well known in social media analysis. That if you do social media analysis, what you are doing is analysis of a certain tranche of the population. You are not doing anything else. And the problem is, when then this particular part of the population is currently overstudied, and the rest is not. And that's certainly something that has been mentioned for less than a number of times. We don't have access to the data about certain areas, so we can't do the research.
Google Books is interesting in that as well. This is also very distorted because it relies on large libraries in the UK on copyright libraries. So it tends to be people who've got access to commercial publishers whose books are deposited.
Absolutely.
People who've only got access to local publishers, their books are only in local libraries and then on Google Books. So it's a huge distortion.
David, for you,
This, if I were to introduce you properly, if you felt a warm glow in the room about 10 minutes ago, it is because Professor David Rowan was there. David is the principal investigator in the Listening Experience project.
Yeah, and big apologies that I wasn't here earlier. The hospital appointment couldn't be changed at all. This is just with relevance to the question we were talking about the way in which, apologies if you already covered this, way in which material goes into a database often defines what we think about it. So Richard was talking about a categorization of particular works, for example. But I think that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is the way stuff comes out of the database and search facilities. And it's something I've been in conversation with Alexandra about, which I want to pick up again. I'll just give you an idea of the kind of problem, a small example of a problem that I've had with all this. I've been working on an 18th, 19th century letter writer who heard a lot of performances in the Colchester area. Now, if I want to get information out of the database about him, and I type in Colchester, I'm not necessarily going to catch those things that happened 3 miles down the road in some little village where he also heard performances. So the searchability and the flexibility and the ingenuity of the search facility, I think, is something that, to an extent, could be a corrective to the kind of problems that we've been talking about. And I just wonder whether Alessandro or anyone else has got any thoughts on that.
Certainly, I would agree, and somehow it relates to some of the points I've been making about instrumentation. But to me, in this kind of project is about creating the material for research. And what the technology brings to it is bringing the instruments, the tools, that make this material actually researchable and studiable. So in some way, your example is an interesting one because it also relates to what Edmund was saying, and in some way, I very much relate to it, which is where you can do research and you can have the base material, but you also need the lab, you also need the microscope, you also need all these things to make whatever you have collected visible. Your example is this specific example, somebody who could be referred by Edmund as a smart programmer could possibly give that to you tomorrow. That doesn't seem to be a major technical difficulty. This is something which is feasible with the level of data we have collected. The interesting question becomes, how do we actually get to either identify the set of the base toolkit that you need to interrogate the database in order to be able to study whatever you want to study, and whether this base toolkit actually exists, if it would be flexible and generate enough, so that any question you could throw at it, and for which there would be an answer in the database, actually you can answer it, or whether it just needs a programmer next to you every time you have a question. And if this base toolkit doesn't exist, do you have your pet programmer in your office and say, go and program me this piece of tool that will help me understand this particular question? And I think this is a fundamental problem. The same people cannot be building the microscope and doing the research with the microscope. It can't be. But the people who want to use the microscope are the ones who need to identify the set of tools that are necessary to do the research. And whether it's still an open question for me whether this set of tools, if there is a kind of abstract finite set of tools that you can be built just to kind of answer any of your questions, or whether it needs somebody to build a microscope for every question.
It's part of the issue with it as well, this assumption you have a database that's set up, you have a front end, and you're stuck with that. And in fact, actually, what you really want to do is to see yourself as a provider of data, and you want the data to be available in all sorts of different forms that are available out there. And I wonder whether we quite integrated into our understanding of the scholarly practice at this stage, where that collection of data, which is to a very large degree what humanities research sits on, actually fits into the process. We tended to sort of think of it in terms of there's the tool, and then we have the great thoughts that come out of it somehow. I wonder if that's an oversimplification.
That's very interesting. I think Helen, we're at lunch now.
We are.
So we'll have to finish now to have lunch. And lunch goes on to 1:30, it's out there. And then we start on these 5 case studies using which are historical and using the students' papers. Before we go have lunch, I'm sure you want to thank everyone who's taken part in this morning section, particularly Edmund and Andrew, who are, as a good, are parts of the lead team that we benefit very much from the contributions. Really benefit from. Thank you very much.